Hey everyone, welcome back. You are here to have a video about the stages of genocide and specifically really about AP World History Mass Atrocities, Learning Target 7.8. This video is going to look at, in general, a lot of these events that caused many people to die. And so we see World War I and World War II are examples of mass atrocity, both on the level of civilians as well as soldiers that died during these events. We also know that the pandemic or the flu of 1918 also caused a significant number of people to die as well, in addition to some famines in Ukraine, as well as then most likely what you've heard about during this time is the Holocaust. And we're going to show you a few other examples of genocide during this time period. So the first question you might be asking is, what is genocide and how do you determine if something qualifies? This is a really hard thing to pinpoint while it's happening and easier to do when you look back at history. Now, genocide, as you look at a definition, is this. It's the intentional action to destroy people, to destroy a people group. Specifically, this usually has to do with maybe an ethnic group of that people group, maybe a national group, racial group, or even a religious group. And the goal we see in genocidal actions is to destroy that whole group or sometimes just part of that group. So here are the 8 stages of genocide. As you see at the bottom, this is not linear. It does not go in order. But usually when you look at a genocide, you will have these 8 different stages at different parts. I would take notes on this as you in this module may have some additional work to look at other examples of genocide and apply these. So some of the stages include classification. This is distinguishing people into an us versus them. This might be one people group and then another people group. For example, German versus Jew or Hutu and Tutsi. Another example of a stage of genocide is when there's some symbolization, meaning that there's a symbol given to the classification of a group. We know, and we'll look at this a little bit more in a second, maybe that's something they need to wear, but there's some symbol that is given to them. Dehumanization is the act of denying the humanity of a people group. So they are equated to animals or vermin or insects or diseases. We'll come back to that as well. Organization basically means that there's plans for genocide, usually by the state, but sometimes by militia, so they can deny their involvement as a government. Polarization is this idea of propaganda to polarize 2 sides next to each other. Preparation means that there is actual separation of victims or separation of different ethnic groups. Death lists are drawn up. Extermination, unfortunately, is the easiest to remember because this is the involvement in the mass killings. And then always after genocide, there's always denial. So if we look at these events in these stages, looking at the Holocaust, you're going to see how this kind of played out. So we know that in the Holocaust, the perpetrators were the German Nazis and the victims were the Jewish people. We also know that other people were targeted, including Romani. We see people who were gypsies, people from Eastern Europe, people who were gay and lesbian, Jehovah's Witnesses, and even more. Now, the death toll that we see is somewhere between 10 to 12 million people who are killed during the Holocaust. Now, if you kind of look through the Holocaust and look through what Hitler was up to, we have a few things I'll put on the screen here. So first of all, we see 1933 to 38, Hitler's rise to power. Okay. The second thing that happens is in 1933, the regime starts setting up its first concentration camps. Now, these are not the extermination camps we're going to see later. It is literally just concentrating people together as political prisoners. There's a lot of propaganda during this stage. And then we see that we move into 39-41, where Germany invades Poland and starts World War II. But then we start seeing the establishment of concentration camps and labor camps for the purpose of the war effort. 42 to 45 then is when we move into the extermination camp. And we see that there's the final solution that's being played out. So as you looked at those last two, we're going to see that is what the video is going to kind of focus on as we look at this today. So first of all, we saw one of those stages is classification. So us versus them. And we see examples here as we look during the Holocaust of really categorizing the us being the Germans and the them being, in this case, a religious group, those who are German. We see symbolization, right, with the yellow star for people who are Jewish, or the Star of David, as a symbol that they were required to wear during this time period. Dehumanization, then, is, like we said, where we equate a group of people, in this case Jews, with some sort of vermin and insects, diseases, etc. So here's an example of them being like a poisonous mushroom. We saw a lot of times they were considered rats. That is dehumanization, making them less human. Organization, then, is the next stage. We see special units are trained up for this to kind of carry out the wishes of the regime. In this case, we saw the formation of the SS would be an example of this. Polarization, then, is the propaganda that's used. The Nuremberg race laws would be key example or evidence of the fact that this happened. Preparation is when they started pulling out the plan for the final solution to target that group of people. They used euphemisms to kind of hide their intentions. So we'll see them call this like ethnic cleansing or purification or counterterrorism. They would not call it actually genocide. They would not call it extermination per se. They would give it a euphemism, another name to kind of hide their original intentions. This also happens for sure in Rwanda as well. 7 is extermination, and we are very familiar with the extermination camps and the gas chambers that were used in World War II. And then we also see denial of these different events. And so we see that there's the war crime trials and people trying to say that they were not responsible for what was actually happening and they were just following orders. So it gets tricky as we look at this. Sometimes they expand these to 10 stages of genocide, but it gets at the same idea here. And that if you ever see events like this and people start again, for example, dehumanization or calling people of different groups like insects or rodents, you're going to start noticing that's a stage. It doesn't mean you're going to get to genocide, but it does mean that that's one of the stages, and you should be aware if other things start happening where groups are persecuted or classified or symbolized as we look alongside of this. So as we kind of go on, I just want to show you a few pictures of my kind of story of when once upon a time I worked for the airlines and flew to Europe, and we kind of did a little Europe trip, and one of the places that we went was Auschwitz, which is one of the extermination camps that you would find in Poland. And so we drove there and actually kind of got lost a little bit on the way, but kind of led our way there and kind of came up on the back roads where we kind of saw, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second, kind of the actual place where people were kept, and you just knew when you got there that you were there. What this is when you were arriving by train, as people were crowded into these basically like cargo compartments, and it says work will make you free, which we know was never a reality for the people that were there. As you kind of look at the story and kind of look at this map, you see Auschwitz and all the different train lines that connected people and the routes they took to get and send people all across Europe to Auschwitz. This camp alone was the largest German concentration camp, as you guys can see on here. But 1.3 million people were in Auschwitz. Again, a majority of them were Jews. And then we see these other groups, Poles, Roman, basically from Romania, Soviet prisoners of war, and other ethnic groups that we see here. About 90% of the people that were there were Jewish, and a majority of them died in the gas chambers. So this is a historical picture if you guys were to look at what Auschwitz looked like historically. And then eerily enough, as we look at some of these other pictures, you'll see what it looks like today, or at least when we went a few years ago. And so when you kind of look at those pictures, you see in the back of this one, right, the same tower that's in the middle here, and this is the same one today. So just totally eerie as you look through this. This is when we are kind of driving in our back roads and going GPS-less and just trying to find our way that we knew we had arrived. And this is what it looks like when you arrive at the other part of Auschwitz, or what they would call Birkenau. And so there's two camps basically across town. The one that you saw here was in another area. And the one in this picture is going to be, this is kind of the first gas chamber. It's pretty small. And we're going to see this was used at Auschwitz 1. This is really close to where the soldiers are staying and living as Germans. And so as you look here, you actually go inside of the gas chamber, and I highly recommend. I know it is hard and dark to do and go this ever, but if you can go to Dachau, if you can go to Auschwitz, I highly recommend kind of that solemn experience. And so here we are in the place where people were killed, right? And they kind of walked us through the process. So you walk into this room, and as you continue on in the hall, it kind of was built into like a berm, like a hill. And at the top of that hill was kind of this compartment where they would drop the gas in from the ceiling. And so that's kind of the empty room where this had happened. And then literally there's like a barn door type structure where you would then open up, and right next door were the incinerators where they would then burn the bodies and keep different things like glasses, clothes, prosthetics. This is different than what you'll see later in the larger gas chambers that were used on the other side in Birkenau. And so you can go through this museum of all these different things where you see all the glasses that once belonged to different human beings, prosthetics, crutches, luggage with real names on them, the sheer amount of shoes that were taken from people and that were still existing. As you look, it's almost overwhelming to think of how many people that is really symbolizing in this picture. And again, there's kind of this story about human hair and how they had, later on shaved people's heads. And then they started to use that hair in this total war, would oftentimes stuff the hair in blankets that soldiers used during the wartime. And the reason they found out about it, because there was arsenic that was found in the stuffing of the blankets, which was used in kind of this poison gas in other areas where they could trace it back to that. So super obviously disgusting and gross and terrible, but things that had happened during this time. We see soldiers' barracks at this place, a really famous wall where a lot of times they would kind of bring people to a basically shooting range. This is in the basement of a place in Auschwitz 1 where you've heard of maybe some famous scientists doing experiments on people that Hitler had commissioned. And in here was kind of a torture room. The wall wouldn't have been broken like this, but you see that small little cube. Oftentimes at the floor, there's kind of that door you can see down there that they would be forced people to climb in, and they would have to remain standing in this very claustrophobic room with 4 other people for hours and hours and hours. Oftentimes they would have to then drag them out as some wouldn't survive the torture that had happened here. And so you kind of go around the camp. There's so many different stories as you look around Auschwitz as a place where these things all happened. This would be the other side where most people were kept at Auschwitz in the railroad cars while you were there. When the Soviets came to try to get to Berlin, as we've talked about before, denial is a huge part of genocide. And so they started to burn a lot of the different places here to show that it didn't happen, to deny it. And so you'll see a lot of places where there's just remains where they try to destroy different things. And so some of these are just ruins, and other places still remain standing as you look around this camp. If you look kind of at this panoramic shot, what you see to the right here that's kind of in rubble was one of the larger gas chambers as they became, quote, more efficient on this side. And so here's the rubble of this, and you kind of can see in comparison to the bottom left of this corner, you see people on the size of this. So it's tragic to know that people did this and really firmly believed that the problem in Germany really was not Jewish people, right? You start kind of going back, and what would it look like if maybe the Treaty of Versailles looked different? Or not even to blame this, like it's just horrific what they decided to do to groups of people. So these are all just images of that fallen area. If you watch any movies that involve the Holocaust, here's some examples of the barracks where people were forced to stay. A picture in here of what maybe a historical picture, and as you kind of can compare the two, you see how people were forced to live in these areas as their bunks and sleep so closely. Especially when you start thinking, we're from Wisconsin, I'm from Wisconsin, and when you think about the winters, Germany has a very similar climate. A lot of Germans moved to Wisconsin in early immigration time, way before this, but because the climate is very similar. So you think of what it's like to try to survive cold winters in this region as well. You see markings on the wall, and again, just what this looked like in this area. And so, super tragic, super sad. And then I just thought this was a powerful that forever, let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity, where the Nazis murdered about 1.5 million men, women, and children, mainly Jews, from various countries of Europe. And so Auschwitz, Birkenau. And so they're just looking purely at these different things that we see. Just one of the death camps across the country of Europe, or the continent of Europe, and different memorials that you see there. And I like this quote too, that the one who does not remember history is bound to live through it again. So unfortunately, this is not the last mass atrocity or the last genocide we see within history. Two other ones for those that are filling out their study guide from my class or doing comparisons. There are two other examples during World War I and World War II. In World War II, another one would be the rape of Nanking. If you guys see the star on the map where this is located, you will see some of these key figures. In this case, we know the Japanese were the perpetrators and the victims were the Chinese. Remember, Japanese are being imperialistic, expanding to these different areas. And the death toll is about 300,000 in that city of Nanking. Japan attacked the city in 1937. We see that this is a little bit before Germany invades Poland. They burn the city, they destroy the city in many ways, and then launched specific attacks against Chinese citizens, also known as the rape of Nanking, if that gives you any idea what they were doing, especially to the women. And so as we look at these figures and we look at what we talked about before of like conduct during war and what is not okay, we know that mass rape campaigns are never okay as a tactic in war, but you see that this happens here. They also butchered male war prisoners and male civilians, people who were not fighting in the war effort, but yet were still targeted. And there's gruesome pictures of this if you did any more research of like different contests that they had and just the treatment of people that were not treated as people. Dehumanization, as we looked at before. About 20,000 women and girls of all different ages were raped during this time, were taken as comfort women for those that were away from home and fighting in this war effort. And makes you feel gross just even talking about it. The Armenian Genocide is another example. If you are filling out the chart, this would go in World War I because this happened more during that time period of World War I. In this case, the perpetrators were Muslim Turks. We see that the victims were Armenian Christians, and the death toll was about 1.5 million people. Some people believe that's a little bit lower, others say it's a little bit higher. Some of the key events as we looked at this, the group that was in charge of this, you've probably heard of before from AP World, is the Young Turks. This is a group of reformers that overthrew the Sultan, as we've talked about before, and wanted a more modern constitutional government. At this point, you're like, this is good. Armenians really hoped under this new kind of government that they also would have a place. But one thing to know is nationalism, guys. Back to this idea, the Young Turks kind of had these three pashas, or these three people that were leading this charge, and they kind of were, again, as we talked about in the past about the Young Turks, their goal was to find basically a Turkish identity, a Turkish nationalism. One religion, right, being Islam, one language being Turkish, one people being this new Turkish state. And so they were trying to remove all threats to that. And as Armenians, or are not Turkish and they didn't have Islam as a religion. We see they were Christian, they were targeted. And so as you look at all these different places where there's massacres, we see in the area of Syria, we see in the area of Turkey, um, as the Ottoman Empire is falling apart during this time. We see different concentration camps across this area. But again, we see people are falling prey to dehumanization and mass extermination. So I hope this video was helpful, as depressing as it may be. But again, as we kind of can leave on that note that we study history so it won't repeat itself. I hope that this is informative and it helps you as you look at the mass atrocities that happened from 1900 to present.